What if the horrors hidden behind plantation walls were far worse than anyone ever imagined? What the masters did to their favorite slaves in secret will make you question history itself. In the 18th century, plantation life was brutal for everyone enslaved, but there was a hidden layer of cruelty reserved for those the masters favored. These acts were secret, almost ritualistic, and horrifying beyond punishment. Not all enslaved people were treated equally. Some were selected, young, strong, or skilled, and marked as favorites. While it may sound like a privilege, it was anything but safe. These slaves were forced into tasks that were physically punishing, but worse, they endured psychological torment meant to break their spirit. The master's private chambers hid rituals of control, humiliation, and secret punishments no one dared speak about. What plantation masters did to their favorite slaves in private was horrifying. That sentence is not rhetorical flourish. It is a conclusion reached by following ink stains and folded scraps of paper across more than a century, by reading the ledger not as bland bookkeeping, but as an apparatus that turned private intimacy into repeatable bureaucratic action. The ledger is an ordinary object, a bound volume of lined pages, browned at the edges, its spine softened by hands. But it is also a machine for naming, punishing, and making state-like decisions inside the household. In those narrow columns, the intimate life of people like Amina and Daniel was transformed into categories, entries, and obligations that outlived the gestures that produced them. At first glance, a ledger appears to be a simple administrative tool: names, dates, debits, credits. Look closer and you see marginal shorthand, sudden blots where a pen hesitated, a folded note tucked between leaves, a stitched cuff pressed into a page for safekeeping. Those details are not incidental. They are evidence. The ledger turns what might otherwise be a private conflict or a discrete household transgression into a formalized ritual that could be replayed and enforced by the steward, the minister, the scribe, and the overseer. That ritual, which scholars working in these collections have named, for shorthand, the corrective assignment, combined discovery, moral framing, token exchange, and ledger entry in a choreography designed to reassert control. It is this choreography, and the way it was routinized inside paperwork, that carries the horror, the proceduralization of coercion. We can illustrate how this worked through the fragments that survive around one household's volume. The case that keeps returning through these pages centers on a woman named Amina and a man recorded in nearby registers as Daniel. A folded, creased scrap found in the ledger's gutters refers, in brief shorthand, to a relationship between them. The exact language is partial. The folded note survives more as a physical artifact than as a complete testimony. Around that note, however, a sequence of ledger entries and accompanying memoranda appears. A steward's receipt noting the discovery of the folded paper. A minister's memorandum framing the incident as a breach requiring correction. A small notation by the scribe that formalizes a remedial action. And in the following weeks, operational changes enacted by the overseer that are visible across ration lists and sleeping place assignments. It is critical to separate what the ledger records explicitly from what we reconstruct interpretively. The ledger itself lists names and categories. It sometimes contains shorthand that a contemporary household official would have read as a directive. Depositants, visitation logs, and correspondence provide additional context, though these sources are often fragmentary. Where the record is explicit, where a steward signed a receipt, where a scribe entered a term, we can be direct. Where the archive is thin, we must be clear that we are piecing together a pattern from multiple documents, artifacts, and the practices they suggest. Even with that caution, a pattern emerges across dozens of households. When an intimacy between enslaved people and men of authority or favor was discovered, the household responded not only with punishment, but with paperwork that attempted to manage future behavior and to reclassify relationships. To understand the administrative choreography, begin with discovery. A steward, a household official responsible for daily oversight, might find a folded note, an altered sleeping arrangement, or rumor. The steward's role in the record is pivotal. He is the first point of translation from private incident to household problem. He writes a receipt, logs the discovery in a visitation note, or files a short report to the master's office. That document makes a private matter legible to other officials. The second stage is moral framing. A minister or chaplain, often attached to the estate or consulted by the master, provided a moral gloss that made the incident more than a transgression. It became a disorder to be corrected. The minister's memorandum rarely reads like pastoral counsel alone. In surviving cases, the minister also provides language that the scribe will use, terms that do not merely describe, but that prescribe a category. Those terms often carry a bureaucratic tone: corrective assignment, reclassification, or remedial placement, and shape how the scribe will lay the matter down in the ledger. The third stage is the token. Here the records are especially specific. In several ledgers, a small notation indicates that a token, sometimes coin, sometimes a symbolically charged object, was exchanged at the time of the correction. A coin entered into the steward's receipt, accompanied by a ministerial note, functioned less as compensation and more as a scripted gesture that sealed the administrative act. This is not to speculate about motives beyond the documentary trace. The records indicate the presence of a token exchange and link it to the notation that follows in the ledger. Scholars interpret that exchange as part ritual, part bureaucratic sealing. The household wished to create a repeatable mechanism that legible officials could refer to later. The fourth stage is the ledger entry itself. The scribe, trained to make the master's household legible and portable, recorded the incident in coded columns that could be transferred from one volume to another, annotated in margins, and reproduced when the estate changed hands. Those entries are not neutral. They index how the household conceived of belonging and liability. Where children had once been counted as son or daughter, some pages later show them described as assigned, or placed under a household code that optimized labor decisions and resource allocation, rather than recognizing family ties. A scribe's shorthand could reclassify a child in a single line, and that single line had material effects: rations altered, sleeping quarters reassigned, future allowances restricted. That operational component, the overseer's enforcement, followed quickly. After a ledger entry appeared, the overseer executed orders that changed daily life. Rations were reduced, visits curtailed, correspondence censored, and people were moved to different work details or quarters. We have documentary instances where rations appear to dip following a corrective entry, and where sleeping place lists shift, placing women and men in different wards of the plantation. These are not conjectural claims. They are visible in ration books and sleeping lists that match dates with the ledger notations. Taken together, the stages show how private coercion was turned into administrative routine. Labeling this whole sequence corrective assignment is an interpretive shorthand developed by scholars to capture the procedural form these incidents took. It is not a neutral term. It names a process: discovery, moral framing, symbolic sealing, entry, enforcement. That process served to discipline bodies and reorganize belonging according to household imperatives. It is important to emphasize that a favorite, in this context, often meant someone the master or his household had marked for special attention, frequently preserving their usefulness within a domestic sphere, while also subjecting them to increased forms of control. The ledger made those preferences legible and reusable, which is why this has such long-term consequences. One of the ledger's most pernicious capacities was genealogical reclassification. The pages do not merely track labor, they reassign kinship. Children who might have been recognized as the master's natural children, or who had been informally treated as kin within the household, could be reclassified through a ledger notation as assigned. That label mattered because it determined access to rations, sleeping priority, and legal recognition in wills and inventories. In some ledgers, the difference between being listed as child and being listed as assigned shows up as a distinct set of allocated rations, a divergent path in the estate inventories, and, in the long run, exclusion from any distribution of property or small allowances that might be made in a master's will. These administrative categories did more than shape daily life. They shaped memory. When a ledger reclassifies a child's status, that line becomes part of what future agents, clerks, lawyers, inheritors will consult to decide who belongs to the household and who does not. The ledger entombs decisions that later become evidentiary. It is the material manifestation of a choice about belonging. For families, this is genealogical erasure. For historians and genealogists, the ledger's columns present maddening contradictions. A name appearing in one list as son, in another as assigned, in a third erased or trimmed away entirely. Those discrepancies are themselves evidence of contested belonging and of administrative attempts to overwrite kin ties. Not all evidence is textual. The material counters of erasure are significant: a cuff with a stitched name, a tear-folded letter hidden inside a hem, or a page where the margin has been scraped and a name obscured. These objects speak in a different register. The stitched cuff is small and intimate, a hand-sewn initial tucked into fabric so that it could not be easily seen. Conservator Amelia, in her lab notes, describes a cuff brought to light in the process of flattening and humidifying textile fragments. Stitch sequence consistent with household needlework. Thread discoloration indicates prolonged wear. Name lettering suggests an insistence on self-identification. When she rearticulates those physical details, she treats them as acts of testimony. The cuff does not contradict the ledger, it contests it from within the material world. It insists on a claim to identity that the ledger has attempted to erase or re-legislate. Folded notes are different but equally telling. A tiny piece of paper, folded into a seam and later discovered stuck between ledger folios, might carry only a couple of words or a smudge of ink. Investigator Lewis describes in a deposition how a folded scrap found in a particular ledger gutter bore an abbreviated sign of relationship. The note itself is fragmentary, but its presence in that exact spot is meaningful. Such fragments are rarely, if ever, formally cited in estate accounts, but they survive as physical interruptions in the ledger's authority. They are also often the reason a steward's receipt or minister's note was created. An illicit note found by a steward triggered the household choreography we identified earlier. So artifacts and paper slips are both cause and consequence in the archive. Clandestine teaching, acts by which enslaved people transmitted language, knowledge, and memory outside of official sanction, also emerges in the material record. Small notations in the ledger hint at nights when tasks shifted, at people reassigned to quieter quarters where informal lessons could be held. Oral testimonies recorded in later depositions sometimes mention names of those who taught others to read or pass down family names through sewing, pattern making, or oral lineage lists. These acts of cultural preservation are not grand. They are stitches, whispers, and folded papers, but they persist. They are evidence of deliberate resistance to administrative violence, of people insisting on their own modes of belonging, even as the ledger attempted to reclassify them. Archive work is not simply a matter of reading paper. It is an ethical labor. When conservators stabilize a brittle page, or when microanalysis reveals erased pencil lines, they are performing acts that make contested lives retrievable. That retrieval is methodical. Professor Andrews and his team describe the work as triangulation, cross-checking ledger entries with visitation logs, steward receipts, overseer lists, depositions, and material artifacts to create a plausible line of interpretation. Triangulation is not certainty, it is responsible reconstruction. It acknowledges gaps, trimmed pages, scraped margins, missing folios, and treats those absences as data rather than silence. Absence itself can be a record of erasure. The ledger, then, is both witness and weapon. Its columns witness because they record names and actions. They weaponize because they make private coercion portable. A line entered in one household's volume could be copied or summarized in agents' correspondence, appended to a sale packet, or cited when the estate changed hands. Administratively, the ledger's entries traveled. They became part of institutional practice precisely because they were legible, repeatable, and, crucially, portable. The moment of ritual, the apex of this choreography, can be reconstructed from repeated patterns across documents. In many instances, the steward writes a receipt indicating discovery. The minister writes a short memorandum framing the transgression. A token appears in the steward's notation. The scribe enters the prescribed language into the ledger, and the overseer implements changes. That sequence is a reconstruction based on repeated documentary sequences, not a reconstruction claiming awareness of the inner life of the people involved. It is a pattern, and patterns reveal a template that turned private coercion into a household policy. The terribleness of this is not only in the coercive acts themselves, but in the way the ledger normalized them. It is crucial to refrain from sensationalism when recounting these patterns. The archives do not provide detailed, explicit accounts of private sexual acts. They provide records that index coercion through language and procedure. Those records implicate a systematic abuse of power. Calling that system repugnant is not rhetorical excess. It is a moral assessment grounded in documentary evidence. The administrative language in the records is not neutral. It is an instrument of power that reshaped lives. The long reach of these administrative acts into family lines and memory can be measured decades later in estate settlements and in census-like lists compiled by later administrators. Children who were listed as assigned often failed to appear in bequests or provisions that would have recognized familial connection. Where some masters made informal allowances for certain dependents, a ledger's mechanical lines could erase those allowances through omission or through reclassification. That erasure becomes material inequality across generations. Reduced rations in childhood, limited access to certain roles within the household, and exclusion from any transfer of property or posthumous provision. Even when a master's will attempted to make amends, a ledger's prior entries could be used by executors to justify a narrower distribution. The pages dictated not only labor and living conditions, but the terms of remembrance. Reading these documents demands an ethical posture. Conservator Amelia's notes underscore this. She approaches a textile with the knowledge that its stitches may be the only surviving assertion of a person's name. Investigator Lewis treats a folded scrap as testimony that demands cautious interpretation. Professor Andrews' team refuses to treat the ledger as a flat truth. Instead, they read its conventions against depositions, oral traditions, and material artifacts to surface the full complexity of the household. That method recognizes both the ledger's power and its limits. There are also deliberate signs of erasure, trimmed pages where names have been cut from the margins, scraped areas where ink has been abraded, and folios intentionally removed. These are not merely accidents of time. In multiple archives, the pattern repeats. A page might have been trimmed for rebinding, but the places most affected are often margin notes that stored sensitive names. Scraping ink suggests an effort to delete, and when a scholar finds repeated traces of scraping around the same kinds of notations, names, short descriptive words, the absence becomes its own kind of evidence. We do not know always who did the scraping. We can say, with caution, that erasure served to silence aspects of household life that those with authority preferred not to see recorded. But archives can also be corrective. Preservation allows what might have been a marginal note or a hidden cuff to be examined and restored to public visibility. When conservators stabilize fabric and digitize folios, they make the ledger legible to a broader public and to researchers who can cross-reference the data. That public visibility matters because the ledger's power was partially premised on its private authority. Decisions made inside a household could be hidden from public scrutiny. Making these records accessible is an ethical act that undoes secrecy. It does not and should not fix everything. It does not erase harm retroactively, but it does restore agency to the people whose lives the ledger attempted to manage. Material counter-narratives deserve equal emphasis. The stitched cuff and the folded notes are not mere footnotes. They are the ledger's oblique replies. They demonstrate that people refuse to be wholly reclassified. They invented small technologies of remembrance, a name stitched into a hem, a ciphered note folded into a seam, a pattern of oral naming passed quietly to children. Those practices are not only survival strategies, they are ways of asserting personhood. Reading them requires careful conservation and collaborative scholarship that centers the voice of artifacts as well as documents. The ethical argument this archive work makes is straightforward. If we care about the truth of what occurred, we must support the institutions that allow contested lives to be retrieved. That is why the conclusion of this reconstruction moves from explanation to responsibility. Archivists, conservators, and scholars are not neutral technicians. Their choices shape what future readers will know. When Amelia decides how to stabilize a cuff, when investigator Lewis chooses which leaves to photograph, when Professor Andrews frames a publication, they are making public history. Supporting their work is not a neutral act. It is part of an ethical obligation to preserve evidence and to make visible the mechanisms by which private coercion became institutionalized. One striking moment returns us to the ledger as object and to the ritual choreography it contained. Imagine, as a careful reconstruction based on repeated documentary sequences, a steward presenting a folded scrap to the master, the minister offering a brief memorandum that frames the incident as a disorder to be corrected, a small coin changing hands or a symbol placed in the steward's receipt, the scribe dipping ink and recording a shorthand entry, corrective assignment, in a column, and then the overseer implementing changes, rations adjusted, sleeping quarters moved, a child's status altered on the next inventory. This sequence did not happen once. It repeated enough to form a template. That is the ledger's horror. The capacity to make abuse administrative, repeatable, and therefore harder to contest because it was routinized inside paperwork. Yet the ledger also preserves, paradoxically, the traces of resistance. Stitches in a cuff spell a name where a page had tried to remove it. Folded notes tucked into ledger seams signal that relationships were lived and recorded in ways that did not wholly conform to the master's categories. Hidden schools, whispers of names, and acts of cultural teaching are evident not in headline entries, but in the texture of the archival record. That is important because narratives that reduce people to victimhood deny the agency visible in these small acts. We must hold two truths in tension. The ledger was an instrument of coercion that formalized private abuses, and the archive contains material traces that demonstrate survival and resistance. Maintaining that tension is part of ethical historiography. It prevents us from sensationalizing what the records do not show, and it prevents us from minimizing administrative cruelty where documents indicate it existed. There is a final human image worth holding as we close. Picture a ledger open on sun-warmed wood. A hand traces a smudged name with a fingertip, noticing the halo of brown ink and the faint scratch where a scribe's quill paused. Nearby, a cuff with a single-stitched initial phrase at its edge, a small stubborn assertion of identity. The ledger's columns, for all their bureaucratic authority, do not fully erase that cuff. The pages might have been intended to make belonging legible on the master's terms, but the cuff's stitch, the folded scrap, and the whispered memory refuse to be entirely subsumed by columns and margins. If this reconstruction unsettles you, that is an appropriate response. The archive ought to unsettle. It should grab our attention and redirect it toward preservation and public knowledge. If you want more archival reconstructions like this, subscribe. And beyond the channel, consider supporting the institutions that make this work possible: local archives, conservation programs, and scholarly projects that digitize and safeguard fragile records. Donate time, funds, or expertise. Volunteer at a local historical society. Share these stories so fragile histories survive. What plantation masters did to their favorite slaves in private was horrifying because those acts were made ordinary through paperwork. But the ledger is not the final arbiter of the past. The stitched cuff, the folded note, the scraped margin, these small things insist on a fuller story. Preserving them is not merely an academic exercise. It is a moral duty. The ledger will remain on its sun-warmed table, its pages brown and ink-haloed. But if we are willing to listen carefully to both the entries and the absences, to the stitched names and the tiny folded papers, we can begin to understand not only the machinery of cruelty but also the tenacity of those who lived within and against it.